look this way.
Not in the camera.
No, look, you can look through.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this press briefing by WWF on the negotiations that are currently drawing to a close on the Global Biodiversity Framework. My name is Guido Broekhoven. I'm the Head of Policy Research and Development with WWF International, and I have with me Vishaish Uppal. She is the Director for Governance, Law and Policy at WWF-India, and Florian Titze, who's with WWF-Germany, the Senior Policy Advisor on International Biodiversity Policy. What we'll be doing is first I'll give a brief overview of our impressions on the negotiations and what we think needs to happen next. And then Vishaish will be talking about an important aspect of the negotiations, which deals with governance and access and benefit sharing. And Florian will provide an introduction on resource mobilization, and then there will be some time for questions and answers. Now, we've been here for 2 weeks to negotiate the Global Biodiversity Framework. Negotiations in this session are drawing to a close. There is still a plenary session at the end where some decisions will still be made on the next steps. But for us, the negotiation of a Global Biodiversity Framework is an incredibly important process. What we would like to see happen at COP15, where we hope that the framework will be agreed, that will be a moment for nature that is similar to the Paris moment for climate. So we've had these negotiations now for the past 2 weeks. They provided an important opportunity to progress towards that important COP15 decision. Where are we at the moment, and what is our assessment of the past 2 weeks? Well, we're very pleased to see that there has been some convergence, important convergence, on what is going to be sort of the mission, the apex goal for that framework, and that is a nature-positive world to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. That is incredibly important for us because that provides the guiding light and sets the level of ambition underneath which all the other elements need to fit together and correspond to that same level of ambition. So having said that there is quite a bit of good progress and convergence on that overarching mission, we think that much more ambition is needed on all the components underneath it. We need to see more action on conservation, conservation of important areas for biodiversity, conservation of species, and also sustainable use of the other areas. We also need to see much more ambition on the drivers that drive biodiversity loss. We would like to see a commitment by COP15 to halve the footprint of production and consumption. Now, even if you had good goals and targets, you still need to implement it. So we also want to see a very strong implementation mechanism and measurability of the goals and targets so that you know where you will be during the course of getting to the goals and targets. So what does that mean for the next steps? We think that really the negotiations have been relatively slow. There's good reasons for that. Parties have not been able to meet for 2 years. There's a complex agenda and dense agenda that they had to work through. And in a way, these 2 weeks here have been sort of a restart of the actual negotiations. Having said that, what we still think is missing is a lack of urgency, is a sense of urgency to really converge and to work towards a common agreement and sort of that level of ambition that is needed. So for the next steps, there's a lot of work that remains to be done. A lot of text has not been agreed, it's in brackets. For many components there's different options still on the table. So a lot of open-ended issues that need to be resolved. And for us it's really important that these issues are resolved before parties get together at COP15 to seal the deal. It's almost inevitable that another round of technical negotiations is necessary. However, these need to be very well prepared and they need to really focus on the key elements that are needed to arrive in Kunming and to so that the agreement can be signed on Kunming and so that implementation can start immediately after Kunming. However, another round of negotiations is necessary, but we think it's not enough. There's a number of very sticky issues that really needs more political will and need to lift the attention to a political level where some of these sticky issues, and particularly around resource mobilization, can be unblocked through a dialogue at a higher level and through commitments and a political strategy to address those issues in time. If we don't succeed in that, we risk arriving at COP15 with an agreement that has still too many ends that are unresolved, which really has risks of last-minute deals and negotiations, which could mean that the overall ambition and cohesion of the framework will not be living up to the nature and biodiversity crisis that we're facing at the moment. We should remember that we're dealing with a real nature crisis, and that there's an estimated 1 million species facing the barrel of extinction. So that's what we're dealing with, and so that is why we're urging parties to really step up the speed of the negotiations. That's our general impression of the process and where we are, and I'll hand over now to Vishaish to delve a bit more into this important aspect of governance.
Thank you, Guido. So I think just taking on forward from what Guido has been saying, that many parties here also strongly feel that all the three objectives of the convention need to be given equal emphasis, and of course the third objective, which is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. I think that is very important, and I think equity is a very crucial aspect. And how do you govern access and benefit sharing, and how do you ensure that benefits actually accrue to the custodians of biodiversity? I think that's a topic which also is contention. Many parties have divergent views, but I think there are really serious and efforts being made to come together and build some consensus around it. Yes, a lot more work has to be done, but I think there are small steps being taken in that direction. So the global biodiversity framework must promote both equitable governance as well as social equity. We do need some just transitions also, both at the global level as well as at the local level. So you need to look at both things. We, as WWF, of course, we firmly believe that this whole GBF needs to be inclusive. All non-stake actors needs to be brought in. Their views and their concerns need to be looked at and addressed and accommodated. And the fact is that, and here what we've seen is that many parties have very clearly acknowledged the role which the IPLCs and local communities play in conservation, that their stewardship is very important, and it's crucial actually in a way to protect Earth's biodiversity. So this is something which is positive. You can see it kind of mentioned in various aspects of the GBF, but like I said, there is work still to be done, and I think what Guido has very clearly put it out, that we know that some intercession work will have to be done. There has to be you have to bring, the parties have to kind of come together, form some consensus on these issues, and look how do we kind of take this forward. And another addition I would like to also say is that they must prioritize, the global biodiversity framework also must prioritize the inclusion and recognition of interests of vulnerable and marginal groups, women, including people living in poverty, so women, youth, and these are also something which many parties are also mentioning it. Many non-state actors also have mentioned it, including us. So these are some important components which should go in and will probably go in into the GBF, but again, how exactly, and that is all, that's the road also which we will see a positive probably outcome in. Thanks, Andres.
Thanks, Vishaish, and then I'll hand over to Florian to talk about resource mobilization, a key element of the framework negotiations.
Thank you, Guido. Yes, indeed. As Guido said, resource mobilization, or the financing component, is a critical element of this entire package that we need to agree on. And I can say quite simply, without ambition and an ambitious agreement on financing, we won't have an ambitious agreement at all, including all the other goals and targets. And one thing that is very clear, and I think most parties and other stakeholders agree to the fact that more resources are needed, financial resources. So more money needs to be there to implement the framework. And that needs to come from all sources that we have available, including international financing, so official development assistance from developed to developing countries and custodians of biodiversity, including IPLCs, as Vishaish has mentioned. but also from domestic budgets, domestic sources, so national financing for the national implementation, and also private financing, so leveraging the financial resources we have from private sources for the implementation. But financing alone, so more money alone, will not be enough. What we also need to urgently address is the harmful financial flows that are continuing to destroy nature. That needs to be part of this package that I've mentioned. So that includes, for example, subsidies, national subsidies that are continuing to harm nature. It also includes reforming the financial sector. So it is no longer acceptable that public and private investments into economic activities are harming nature. So we need to include that into a just transition, a sustainable transition going forward. And a third element, which is sometimes overlooked, is that we need to have more bang for the buck, basically. So every dollar or every euro, whatever currency you want to use, that is spent on conservation of biodiversity needs to achieve more. So we need to do better with what we have available. And these things all include or combine this package that we need for financing. These things need to work together, and they need to form sort of a plan that we then have for the implementation. So there is enough resources available for the implementation in this decade we have in front of us. So with that, I'm coming to how these negotiations on financing and all these things have been going in the last 2.5 weeks. And we unfortunately have to say that progress on this has been very, very slow. There's a lot of disagreement, in particular between developed and developing country parties, because it's also a lot to agree on. There's different interests, and there's a long way in front of us to get to a more common ground and achieve consensus, because we need a framework that works for all, and that includes resources. What needs to happen going forward? Well, as Guido has said, more intersessional work is needed. We have some time until COP15, and more progress needs to be made. So that includes informal discussions. Parties need to be meeting face to face, build more trust, understand each other better, especially in this very sensitive and political issue that is the financing component. And they need to also delve more into the technical component, because one thing I want to say very clearly is that we cannot repeat the same mistakes that we've made 12 years ago in Nagoya in Japan, when we agreed on targets that we want to achieve, but we didn't agree on how we're going to get the financial resources to do so. And that really led to a delay in implementation, and ultimately we know that the last strategic plan wasn't very successful. So one thing that cannot happen is that we leave Kunming when we finally will hopefully achieve an outcome there without also agreeing on the financial aspects and the resource mobilization. And that includes the strategy of resource mobilization. And I'll leave it at that, and I'm welcoming any questions.
Any questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Daisy Zeller from Carbon Group in the UK. I just wanted to ask, could you expand a bit on countries that are kind of resisting financing side of things in terms of developed countries, and what also developing countries are calling for, and which developing countries are being the most vocal? And also just to everyone, do you think that the other issues going on in the world, like at the moment, like the war in Ukraine and everything else, has kind of cast a bit of a shadow on the talks and sort of hampered progress going forward about the attention of the world on what's happening?
Maybe I'll take that general question first, and then you can talk on resource mobilization. Well, first of all, of course, we're extremely concerned about the war in Ukraine. We're really concerned of the fate of the people there. Also, our colleagues that are in Ukraine, we're extremely concerned about that, and we're very carefully monitoring what the impact is also for our work there. What is important here is that we are negotiating an agreement to stop and reverse nature loss, and that in itself is an important foundation to promote peace and working together and sort of living in harmony with nature. And that's actually ingrained in the convention text, which references peace as a result of nature conservation. So I think that's the link we're making. In that sense, we believe that it is really important that we continue to negotiate that pillar of peace and harmony and well-being, which is halting and reversing biodiversity loss. Maybe on resource mobilization, would you like
Yeah.
to say something?
Thank you, Guido. Well, as I've mentioned, there is a political divide currently that we clearly see between developed and developing country parties. And I've mentioned at the beginning sort of these various components that we need as a package. We need all of these. Where's disagreement, and a lot of disagreement currently, is which of these components, so for example more financing, or rather reducing the harmful financial flows, which of these should be in the focus, how much we need of each. For example, of course, many developing country parties are calling for significantly increased financial resources, in particular from international sources, so official development assistance. Some developed country parties feel that some of the figures that are flowing around aren't what they consider as appropriate. But I mean, at the end of the day, as I've mentioned, we need to find consensus and get common ground. As we've been saying, all of these components, all these elements are critically important. We need all of them. So the outcome that we hope for is that really parties are coming together and find an agreement that works for all of them on how we can best combine this and morph it to a plan that links to implementation and really provides us with the resources that we need in this decade to implement the framework.
We have two online questions. The first one is, we have heard division over DSI, with some threatening to collapse the agreement without a multilateral sharing mechanism. Are you worried COP15 could be a Copenhagen moment for biodiversity? And the second one is WWF working with the presidency to make sure civil society is represented and present in Kunming?
So there's three elements. The first one on the chances of success in Kunming. We think that this is, we don't want to make parallels with Copenhagen. I think the context and the situation is really very different from that moment, which was a long time ago. Nevertheless, we are concerned about the slow progress that we've seen over the past 2 weeks, and we're really urging parties, as we've outlined before, to speed up progress, because there is a number of complex issues that need to be untangled and that need to be addressed, including resource mobilization, but indeed also DSI, before we can move towards an overall package that is ambitious, fit for purpose, and ready to be implemented. We are working with all parties and also the Secretariat and the Bureau and the Presidency to express our desire to be fully engaged in the process as civil society. We're doing that with other civil society organizations as well. It is incredibly important that all stakeholders continue to be engaged in the process, as was decided by the parties at COP14 when they started this process. When there is time pressure like there is now, there's always a challenge to give sufficient space for civil society organizations, and we continue to pressure parties to make that space available. Maybe on DSI, would like to say a few
Yeah,
words?
I mean, I think Guido said that clearly, that yes, there are very clear, very divergent views. But I think because also the fact that this was the first time they've really come together and physically kind of sat in a room and negotiated. Yes, there is a text which is full of brackets, but I'm really hoping, and I think even parties are really earnestly, trying to work together to find a solution. And we really hope that, there is, whenever in the intersessional sessions plus the next, the Nairobi meeting as well as the Kunming week, get a solution out of it, yes.
Hi.
Yes.
Regarding the DSI, could you explain what are the different positions and the main divisions between countries regarding that issue?
I mean, see, broadly, the issue is that what kind of a policy option should be probably looked at, and it is a very technical, technical theme or technical aspect also. So I think every party also needs to understand it from their perspective, because every party has their own views on it and what they are bringing here. And I think, yes, there is a divide, but I think parties are kind of, listening to what each one is saying. So it's also a lot, I mean, you've seen there's a lot of kind of convergence on need for capacity, technology transfer. So those are the kind of issues which I think are probably easier to build consensus on. But what real modalities will be adopted, when will be adopted, how that will be done, I think those are the kind of things which still needs a lot of discussion. And I think, DSI came up, I think, like, also, I mean, in the agenda, like when it was COP14 who kind of, said that let's like kind of start looking at it. So it's also a new, relatively new topic. And if you have, so many parties, they have all their own, kind of perspective, and that has to be, one has to kind of bring everything on the table and then see what's the common ground.
Yeah, Daniela Careto from Brazil, Valor Econômico Brazil. Two things. One is about the 30 by 30 target, the goal, where is it? And also if you can mention, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 controversial targets. I know there are 21 controversial targets, but just to pick 1 or 2 or 3, which do you think, just to talk a little bit about the targets itself.
Yeah, so on the 30 by 30, it is a proposal that is on the table and that has been discussed, but there are other versions of that target as well on the table. I think what is really important, and that is also on the table, is that is made conditional on securing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to their lands and waters, and with their free, prior, informed consent. Another really critical element is that this is complemented by equally ambitious targets to address the drivers of biodiversity loss, because with increased conservation alone, you will not be able to get there. You need to have action to address the footprint. All these things are on the table. However, as I said, there's also different options and different versions of all these issues on the table. So it's at this stage, it is difficult to see where the discussions will be going. Other areas where there is quite significant discussions is around, indeed, what is the role of government to address these drivers, and particularly the private sector? Is it an encouraging role, or is it a more forceful role to really provide a level playing field for the private sector to become nature positive, to work towards a circular economy? The other one that is contentious, that is debated really, is around how do you address pollution and what do you include in that pollution target in terms of numerical values, which is an issue really across a number of targets. We think it's really important that you put as much as possible measurable elements in the targets, and that is across a number of targets really still under discussion. What's also being discussed, and what's really important for us, that you don't only agree on actionable targets, but that you also have a way to measure what these targets add up to by 2030. So that it's not only, okay, we've put in place measures, but do they actually achieve the intended outcomes by 2030? And we shouldn't be waiting until 2050 to measure that, because that's too late. We want to know by 2030 whether we're on track to achieve 2050 goals.
Sorry, it's Perimeter from France. And what makes you think that it can be different in Nairobi? Is it because if it has been so slow here in Geneva, is it just a matter of time, and with more time people will converge, or do you feel that it's going to be just the same in Nairobi?
Yeah. Well, time is important, but it's certainly not the only factor, and we believe that the context in Nairobi may be a bit better because parties here came together after 2 years of not being able to meet. There's actually a lot of new people that have come in, so there's a few things that are making us hopeful for Nairobi. At the same time, more of the same will not do the trick. We really need to have a change of tack. We need to have a more focused agenda. We need to have more focused discussions geared towards an outcome that is ready for adoption at COP15. That also means that the preparations leading up to the meeting in Nairobi need to be very focused and really work towards the critical elements that need agreement, both in that technical negotiation track and at the political level, where the more complex issues really need to be addressed and brought. Only then, I think, Nairobi is useful and will be providing the step change that is necessary.
I don't know if you can talk a little bit about the parties, how they behave. So China, India, Brazil, the US, I don't know if you can talk a little bit. And also about the indicators. Is there any progress on monitoring this framework, and what kind of things you're seeing coming?
In terms of the indicator framework, indeed, that's been discussed, and the issue there is indeed what indicators you can use to measure progress on the goals and targets. That's also a very technical and complex issue, partly also because you can actually only lock in your indicator once you've agreed what your goal and target is. But because of the time pressure, these processes are going on in parallel, and what's been agreed is there will be further technical exchanges and discussions between now and the next meeting of the open-ended working group to further resolve that. For us, it's really important that the whole package of indicators is as comprehensive as the package of goals and targets. And for example, we've identified a really, really critical gap already in what was on the table before we got here, which is measuring not only species extinction but also the abundance of species. And there is a very good indicator available for that, the Living Planet Index. Unfortunately, that was not included in the first draft proposal. We're pleased to see that it is back on the table as part of the list of potential indicators. So that is really an important aspect indeed, the indicator framework, where a lot of work still needs to be done. In terms of party dynamics, I think what we're seeing in general is that different parties are more ambitious on certain aspects of the framework, are more specific on certain aspects of the framework, and other parties have more interest in other elements of the framework. So it really depends on the areas that we're talking about to see where parties put a particular emphasis. Okay, well, with that, thank you very much for your attention and for being here in the room and virtually as well. Thank you very much. Obviously, we still have a closing session to follow, and we're keen to see what will be coming out of that. But for now, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.